I am so glad you convinced me that the family car should be the Defender 110. It is so beautiful inside. It's so comfortable and it just feels indestructible.
Yes, it really is. I've been waiting a long time for the new model to come out. The Defender 110, I'm telling you, it's my favorite car of all times. It's my third one. You know, I have stories of going off road. The guy managed the group. He was like, "What are you doing in this beautiful car?" I'm like, "I'm going off road." He's like, "Are you sure? Because you can use one of ours." And then they look like Mad Max cars. I'm like, no, we're going to do this. And he was shocked.
Wow. Well, it's great because the Defender has been reimagined for 21st century adventure, and its unparalleled off-road ability as well as its robust interior are invaluable whether you're headed towards uncharted territory or just a weekend of exploration. The Defender 110 tackles challenging surroundings with absolute confidence. The SUV conveys strength outside and in, featuring peerless technology like an intuitive driver display and an award-winning infotainment system. That's my favorite part, to keep you connected no matter where the journey takes you. Adventure is unique to everyone, and so is the Defender. Choose from the two-door Defender 90, the four-door Defender 110, or the larger Defender 130 with the ability to seat up to 8 passengers. You'll find uncompromising performance in all three. So pack up and go even further with the Defender 110. Learn more at LandRoverUSA.com/Defender.
Sometimes it takes a different approach to help you unlock your true potential. Capella University's game-changing FlexPath format helps you learn at your own pace and fit earning a degree into your life. From before you enroll to after you graduate, you'll be supported by people who are invested in your success so you can pursue your goals knowing that help is available if you need it. Imagine your future differently at capella.edu.
This isn't your average business podcast, and he's not your average host. This is the James Altucher Show. Today on the James Altucher Show.
There's frames in every part of society, right? We live in a socially constructed reality, meaning that there's the objective world that exists, right? That is like stones, air, H2O, right? But then there is a world that is layered on top of it, of social agreement. So the fact that money is valuable is a frame. A lot of our relationships are built on frames. Like, you know, the dreaded friend zone, right? Is it just a frame that you're more of a friend than a lover? And a lot of times, frames don't even just work in like context of a conversation. They're like the roles that people bestow upon you. Any type of coronation process is to, like, have you ever been to a graduation? Like, a whole graduation is a frame that what we're doing is really special. But what you really did was go to college, you fucked off for 4 years and you studied something and got some grades, but they make it
Don't get me started on this. Like,
Yeah.
The podcast could veer in a completely different direction for 3 hours. And we'll get more into what frame control is and how you structure this book, which I find very interesting from a writing point of view, a writing of self-help point of view. But just in that specific example, and the friend zone example. So the friend zone I'm very familiar with. I've lived inside the friend zone most of my life. So all of these are situations where there's no real rules and there's kind of like fictional man-made rules. There's sort of like, you know, status hierarchies, like, oh, in a workplace, someone who's a VP, a vice president of the corporation might have higher status than an assistant vice president, but you go outside the corporation, there's no hierarchy. Mm-hmm. So you're kind of taking advantage of shifting hierarchies depending on context as well.
Most definitely. And just cultivating awareness of somebody can just feel more powerful than they are because they have a badge, right? Like everybody, you know, a mall cop has a badge and he's meant to look as similar to a cop as possible, even though he doesn't really have authority over you in the situation. He can't touch you, none of that. But you feel like he has authority. And so one of the things that Brendan and I really wanted to lay out is, number one, looking for what are you buying into? Right? A lot of times when we give someone power over us, there's usually a reason, right? Maybe it's a very pretty person. Maybe it's a very tall person. And we feel ourselves suffocating in a certain way.
And why are we suffocating? Because we grew up thinking, for the past 1,000 occurrences, tall people have intimidated me, or someone who looks better than me has intimidated me, or someone who has more money has intimidated me. And so we start to react in these old ways instead of kind of being aware, like, oh, I'm reacting in an old way, and this is an opportunity to practice what Bill's saying about frame control.
Exactly. What we're teaching you is kind of to cultivate an awareness within conversations to what is actually happening.
I got Bill Beteet on the podcast to talk about his new book, co-written with Brendan Lemon, called The Power Bible. But also, we're going to talk about Bill. I kind of didn't want to do this podcast, actually. And I'll tell you why. I feel like, as opposed to all the BS self-help books I read all the time, or, that people push on me all the time, you're describing like a real superpower here. Like, I almost want to keep these techniques for myself and not tell anybody. Like, I was sitting next to Robin while I was reading the book, and I was going to say to her at different points, oh, see, here's what Bill says in the Power Bible about what you should do when you're in an argument with a spouse. I'm like, no, I better not tell her this one because I'm going to use this technique.
It 100% comes back to bite you, where like I've been in fights with girlfriends and they've been like, are you using one of your frame control tactics right now? I'm like, oh man, I knew I shouldn't have sent that essay I wrote.
And also the other, but I'm so excited also to talk to you about this because I recognize, first off, thank you for mentioning me several times in the book. And I have some take on at least one of those stories that you mentioned. But so much of this I recognize from conversations you and I have had since 2015, where I actually made specific use of your tactics. And we'll describe what this book is about in a second, but I specifically made use of we've spoken hundreds of hours on the phone about business situations, relationship situations, social situations, other types of sales, negotiations, everything. And you were always thinking like, if you say this person's going to probably say either this, and then you have to say this. It's almost like a chess game. And you were always so dead on right. And so now I see it all come together in this book form, and I know these techniques work. So I just want to let me describe, I know you haven't been speaking, let me describe it at 10,000 foot level what this book is about, and you could correct me along the way. So it's called The Power Bible, but it's really about what you call frame control. And the idea is that in mid to high stakes situations, like let's say you're asking your boss for a raise, or you're in an argument with a loved one, or you're in a sales pitch or an important negotiation, or even if you're at a party or, trying to meet someone in a bar, one person has the frame and the other people usually don't. And the person with the frame has so many opportunities to succeed in those situations that, high stakes turn into high reward.
Most definitely. Like it's really like determining the rules that everybody else plays within conversation. And we so tacitly buy into other people's frames and we don't know the implication, right? Like when we attribute the amount of deaths that Stalin caused, he didn't personally do those things, but he manifested the power and the frame within himself to make people kill their family and kin. And that's an extreme example, but you have to remember, like, a guy like Stalin was a peasant, and he grew up to be the most powerful man in the world through understanding some of these tactics. And if people around him had understood some of these things that he was doing, they might have put up walls, they might not have been as easy to buy in. And that's an extreme example, but we have these happen all the time.
Well, and in that example specifically, it almost seems like Machiavellian, and there is components of this book that feel that way, but you address that as well. You have, and we'll get to this later, you have sections on like frame addiction, or, using this for the wrong purposes probably won't work out for you the way you think. But, you give this one example of what frame control is, and it's not a very, it is a real world example, but it's not something that happens every day. So I want to take this example, and because it's a perfect example of what you mean, but then describe some other examples. So you give an example where, let's say you and Brendan just witnessed a murder, and the police come afterwards and ask you what happened, and you say, well, that guy just killed that other guy. Person A just killed person B. And that's what you say. And then Brendan says, well, person A was defending himself, so had to kill person B. So this is a great example where whoever has the stronger frame, you or Brendan, in front of the cop, that's high stakes in that someone's life is either gonna, like person A is either gonna go to jail for the rest of his life or is gonna be a free man. So that's the importance of frame control. Only one of you can have the frame in that situation. The cop's only gonna believe one of you, say, and in an extreme case. And the consequences of who has the frame is life-changing for person A. And so the same thing might happen, though, if someone's asking for, let's say, just $1,000 raise from their boss. They either have the frame, and no boss wants to give, an employee in their corporation a raise. So either the employee has good frame and is able to easily get the raise, or the boss has the frame and is easily able to not give the employee a raise, and the employee will feel good about it. So what's another example, say, of like everyday situations?
I mean, a lot of our relationships are built on frames, right? Like a lot of the dreaded friend zone, right? Is it just a frame that you're more of a friend than a lover? And a lot of times frames don't even just work in the context of a conversation. They're like the roles that people bestow upon you. So there's frames in every part of society, right? We live in a socially constructed reality, meaning that there's the objective world that exists, right? That is like stones, air, H2O, right? But then there is a world that is layered on top of it of social agreement. So the fact that money is valuable is a frame. And it's a frame. There's a reason why there's a symbolic process for money being valuable, because it gives the frame of importance to money, the sacredness of money. There's the reason why it says, in God we trust on money. So it's bestowed with this kind of big importance, this big procession. No one really knows how money is made. It comes from all these different Byzantine ways. There's these weird stamps in it. And that lets you know that it is something of value. Any type of coronation process is to, have you ever been to a graduation? Like a whole graduation is a frame that what we're doing is really special. But what you really did was go to college, you fucked off for 4 years and you studied something and got some grades, but they make it
Don't get me started on this.
Yeah.
The podcast could veer in a completely different direction for 3 hours.
But it is, they do all of these things to make it symbolically seem important. And the more you recognize, and one of the first things that you asked me to do the first time we hung out, the first time I did this podcast, was you said, I should go up and ask whether I could get something for cheaper. And so when I left, I just walked into CVS. It's like, hey, can I get this for a little bit less? And the guy just found a coupon for the thing and got me a discount.
Right, because and we'll get more into what frame control is and how you structure this book, which I find very interesting from a writing point of view, a writing of self-help's point of view. But just in that specific example, and the friend zone example. So the friend zone I'm very familiar with. I've lived inside the friend zone most of my life. And you describe it in this book as like an example of a covert contract. So it's basically let's say it's a guy and a girl. The guy in the friend zone has this covert contract, and maybe the woman is aware or not aware of it, but he thinks if he's just nice and friendly and so on, the contract is supposedly that eventually it will turn romantic. And the woman may or may not be aware of this covert contract. And your point is, for a lot of the things that we just sort of assume and live by are kind of man-made rules of society or parents or whatever status hierarchy you belong to, and they're not real rules. But then you use this example in the store. So I said to you, go into any store, go into like a deli, order a coffee, and then when he charges you $1, say, hey, can I have 10% off? Can I pay 90 cents? And see what they say. And your point there is that we normally have a contract that in a store, if someone says, oh, the price of this coffee is $1, we hand over $1. But your point is that a lot of these rules, even rules that we think are really like just carved in stone, are very bendable. You're not saying break the rules, but you're saying you can use frame to bend as far as possible in these rules. And when there's gray areas, like in a deli, as opposed to, let's say, I don't know, where it might not be bendable, like in a bookstore, you can't really, in Barnes & Noble, you can't negotiate the price of a book. But in a deli, you might be able to negotiate the price. It might be bendable, or it might be a little bit more, there's no hard and fast rules about pricing. Whoever has a stronger frame can use it to their advantage to get more items for the dollar.
Most definitely. And the key difference between the deli and Barnes and Noble is nobody in Barnes and Noble has the authority to make things cheaper because the books are set price by publishers and like corporate. It's like beyond, it's not the manager's job to make price. But when you're at the deli, usually the person who has the authority is maybe one level up, or maybe it's just the person at the cashier owns the place. And so they have the authority in that moment to make the price malleable. And so a lot of times the people who have the strongest frames are people who aren't present. That's why corporations have a really strong frame, because they're not present. It's like spiritually passed down. And so no one there has the authority to negotiate on the price. Whereas if you're at a car lot, you have to just go and talk to the guy who the dealership's boss, and he's like, yeah, that could work, and it's negotiable.
Or it seems like things are negotiable when it's a philosophical question. So in the deli or in any store, in any retail transaction, there's a saying, the customer's always right. But that's actually a principle that's always under debate. Sometimes the customer is not always right. Sometimes you say no to the customer. And so this is always under debate between management and the customer. And you're kind of taking advantage of the fact that there's not a hard and fast answer to who is always right by using what you call frame control and the techniques of frame control, which we'll describe in a second, to make that question go more in your direction. So it's the same thing. So I just want to say your background, which is, since I've known you, you've been a lawyer, a dating coach, a comedian, probably other things. And every one of those, and Brendan Lemon, who you co-wrote this with, has been a salesman in many different jobs. So these are all situations that are mid to extremely high stakes where, where what you're calling frame control is extremely important to see the outcome. So like when you're a lawyer, there's no hard and fast rule that the defense always wins or the prosecutor always wins. So you've got to use frame control to make sure the jury is listening to you more than the other lawyer, the opposing side's lawyer. In sales, one side does the sale or rejects the sale. In asking someone out, one side says yes or says no. And so all of these are situations where there's no real rules, and there's kind of like fictional man-made rules. There's sort of like, status hierarchies, like, in a workplace, someone who's a VP, a vice president of the corporation might have higher status than an assistant vice president, but you go outside the corporation, there's no hierarchy. Mm-hmm. So you're kind of taking advantage of shifting hierarchies depending on context as well.
Most definitely. And just cultivating awareness of somebody can just feel more powerful than they are because they have a badge, right? Like everybody, a mall cop has a badge and he's meant to look as similar to a cop as possible, even though he doesn't really have authority over you in the situation. He can't touch you, none of that. But you feel like he has authority. And so one of the things that Brendan and I really wanted to lay out is, number one, looking for what are you buying into? Right? A lot of times when we give someone power over us, there's usually a reason, right? Maybe it's a very pretty person. Maybe it's a very tall person. And we feel ourselves suffocating in a certain way.
And why are we suffocating? Because we grew up thinking, for the past 1,000 occurrences, tall people have intimidated me, or someone who looks better than me has intimidated me, or someone who has more money has intimidated me. And so we start to react in these old ways instead of kind of being aware, like, I'm reacting in an old way, and this is an opportunity to practice what Bill's saying about frame control.
Exactly. What we're teaching you is kind of to cultivate an awareness within conversations to what is actually happening. Because there are times where you're like, I don't know why I went along with that for so long. But the thing about being in somebody else's frame, and how I describe frame is the art of controlling perception, right? That's why propaganda, all these other things is about controlling perception. And in a moment, it's very malleable. In a conversation, it's very malleable. And how you control that, how people are viewing something that you're doing is very important. And when you're talking to maybe like somebody taller, right? You're like, they're looking down on me. This is kind of like you don't even pick up on, I'm agreeing to things I wouldn't usually agree to. And one of the things that Jordan B. Peterson says, and a video that really moved me, was stop saying things that make you weak. Well, first you have to understand, what are the situations that are compelling you to say things against your own self-interest? Because a lot of frame control is reflexive. A lot of times we reflexively are who we are. And that's why it's so hard to change, because you're like, naturally in a situation, I just defer to someone else's authority. And we want you to question that. Why am I deferring? What is the feeling and sensation going on in my body? So that you don't end up signing contracts with people, metaphorically within conversation, that you don't want to cash, and end up living in a prison of a life that you don't want.
Yeah, you say in the book, and this is really important. This is the one way to know that you're in the control of someone else's frame is if you have to spend more time convincing them. So, like, if I say, Bill, you're sexist, racist, and you say, no, I'm not. I have friends who are this. I have transgender friends.
Yeah.
I
My dad's black.
so like, what if you find yourself just reacting and convincing someone, then chances are you have the weaker frame. And the more you try to convince them, the weaker your frame becomes. So what would you say in that case? If someone like makes some universal broad judgment on you that you know is not true and you want to combat it, and maybe it's even in front of you, so it's in front of other people, so it's high stakes, what would you say?
So first, I want to make this very clear to everybody listening. The reason why convincing is a weak frame is because it is contingent on their acceptance of what you say, so it gives them all the power. Now, what you say is, look, I'm not trying to convince you, which basically takes it out of their hands, right? You're not looking for them to basically validate what you're getting ready to say. Then you make your point like, hey, and what I would say in that instance is like, look, if you're labeling me this early in the conversation, you don't want to have common ground with me, and I'm not going to continue a conversation where someone is going to belittle me and label me rather than interact with my ideas.
So you're basically labeling their labeling.
Exactly.
So we'll talk about labeling in more, but so one technique is to basically say you're doing this and it's not fair in this context. So that's one technique. Another one is, and you talk about humor to deframe somebody, and it reminds me of the first rule of improv, which is to say yes and, to kind of increase the humor without creating confusion or conflict in the scene. So, in this case, maybe you could say, yeah, I'm a racist and sexist, which is why, of course, darker than you, and, whatever else you would say, I don't know. But
yeah, well, so when we call humor, and I go into this, we had so the book actually was twice as long because we went into exact situations where we're like, this is kind of getting petty a little bit. But with humor, it's a dangerous way to take back frame. What I call is it's high risk, high reward. Because whenever you're in a situation where you don't have frame, and you know this from doing stand up, is when you're bombing, it's harder to be funny. And we can bomb in conversations. We can feel like that. So, and if the joke doesn't work, you actually spiral down deeper. But if it does work, you get everybody else on your side, because when someone is laughing, they're basically giving a physical indicator that they are responding positively to what your idea is. They're tacitly accepting it. That's why when in comedy clubs, it's the best clubs, you can't see anybody because a lot of people look to other people for approval of like, oh, is it okay to laugh at that? That's something that a lot of people say. And the reason why they say that is because when you laugh at that, you're saying, I kind of get it. And so that's why humor is really powerful. But we also, and this part didn't make it in the book, but I put it in my course, was there are people like who are really funny who kind of we all hate because we can't be mad at them, but they're constantly insulting us. So we talk about how to basically mitigate the damage that they do in a certain environment by saying like, hey, dude, like, grow up. Like, I get it. You're funny, but like, we need to get work done.
But I feel like in this one-on-one situation, I'm thinking specifically of this situation where someone's trying to call you out, and it's not in a party where, you're feeling kind of awkward and there's like a bigger, funnier guy who's everybody's laughing and you're feeling off to the corner and feeling insecure. And then you try, and like you even mentioned, there's like a typical scene in the movies where someone tries to say something funny and everyone just stares at them and they get
100%.
even weaker. So it's like, you're right. That's an example of like high risk, high reward. Like if you fail at it, you're more in the corner. But in this one-on-one situation, I say, Bill, you're being so blah, blah, blah. And you kind of take this improv technique or humor technique, and turn it into humor. I feel like that's a little easier in one-on-one.
It's easier in one-on-one, but one of the things that you always want to be aware of is what is the meta frame. So if you're at work and somebody says this, you have to think about what are the stakes at where you're at, right? So if you're in a casual conversation, someone's like, you're like a racist, like, yeah, man, I'm so racist. That's why I got me a black dad. Then it's something like kind of like fun. But if you're at a job where an accusation like that is is actually serious, you have to basically meet it with basically the surroundings or the surrounding context, which someone is labeling you that with that label. So it's all about like, you have to always understand what is the meta frame. Why are you there? What is the context of the situation? What is the social game being played? And, you know, a lot of times, you know, I do this in reflection, not in the moment, right? But the more you reflect on it, the more you're like, oh, you know, this is why this was, it becomes more and more automatic. So I'm not expecting people to listen to this podcast and be like, oh, the meta frame is this. And so therefore do insult C, you know, but when you understand like, hey, like you're saying this to me, like, let's say I'm at law school and someone labels me like that. I have to shut that down, because if that gets around, then all of a sudden I'm losing out on hiring opportunities. I'm getting locked out of clubs, all of these other things. I'm getting a bad reputation. Your reputation starts at law school. So if someone calls me a racist and a misogynist, and I'm not even going to entertain this discussion, because you're basically saying you're not, number one, you're not listening to me. And the fact that you're labeling me so early means that you're not trying to understand me. That creates a completely different thing. And it makes them sit with it. It makes them feel like the bad guy leaving the conversations.
Well, and I love how I'm always going to interrupt.
Yeah.
Sorry. I love how even with that response, you have frame control techniques that they could then do, which is they could pull back even further and say, listen, it's important for us to, you know, it's important. If you're going to go out and be a lawyer, because let's say this is happening in law school, if you're going to go out and being a lawyer, it's important for us to know kind of your philosophical beliefs about, you know, the law on these very important issues. So they're even going out further and labeling that you're trying to avoid these important issues.
Most definitely. We call it the zoom out technique. And basically what that is when in any moment when you're arguing with somebody, you can either say they're getting lost in details, which is zooming in, right? So if they're getting really technical, all of us have had those moments where you're talking to someone and then they start using a lot of big words within the conversation that you don't really understand. And you're like, all you have to say is like, hey, you're losing the forest for the trees, man. Like, we need it, blah, blah, blah. And you try to keep the conversation higher level, right? But let's say they're zooming out too much and they're like, oh, this is like an existential thing and blah, blah, blah. Then you can zoom out on this and be like, hey, like, you know, when that person zooms out, you're like, oh, well, actually, it does matter in the greater context. And one part of the book that we have in there is using logical fallacies both as a weapon and a shield. So like, for instance, calling me a racist and a misogynist, that's an ad hominem. You're attacking my character, not my arguments, right? And so you're like, you label it. You label, hey, that's an ad hominem. You're attacking my character. You're not attacking the merit of my arguments. And what you're talking about is like, no, and you're in this instance, your character matters, right? So if like someone's defending Trump or someone's attacking Trump and they're like, oh, hey, like, you know, he's a racist and a misogynist, right? And someone's like, oh, that's an ad hominem. You're not actually attacking his platform. It's like, well, if he's going to be president of the United States, it matters whether or not that is his character, right? So you double down on that part as kind of a shield.
Yeah. So, and by the way, I feel like we haven't even started the podcast yet. Like, this is just all kind of stuff peripheral to, I mean, this is all in the book, but it's almost like we just skipped 6 chapters in the book. But I want to say too, what I appreciate about the book is that a lot of these self-help books that I see are based on scientific research over, let's say, one aspect of life. So I'm going to make up the name of a book. I don't even know if this is a real book or not. Let's say there's a book called The Power of Consistency. So someone might say, hey, if you do the same single routine every single day, that will make you better in life. And here's the research. Like, if you eat your meals at the same time every day, you'll digest better. If you meditate at the same time every day, you'll be more calm, you'll live long. So there's that kind of self-help book, which is just very simple techniques and research-based, but not coming from the person's experience that much. And so I find them to be not that useful for living a better life. And then there's the kind of and they usually just focus on one thing, like consistency, as opposed to the fact that life is complicated and sometimes you can be consistent, sometimes you can't, and so on. And then there's the kind of self-help books where I feel just the advice is very surface. And I'm not criticizing them. Like, for instance, I think Robert Cialdini's book, Influence, is a great book about, in very specific situations, how to put together a message that persuades people. So he uses techniques like social proof, saying, hey, all your friends are doing it, maybe you should do it. He uses techniques like authority. Hey, you know, David Beckham's doing it, works for him, you should probably do it. You know, he uses reciprocity, like, I gave you this, so you should, reciprocate. And but it's like kind of this very simple tool chest of 6 or 7 items that do work. If you're making like an ad campaign or a copywriting campaign or an email marketing campaign, these techniques work. But what I appreciate with yours, and this is the important part, is that you don't even begin talking about how to get frame control until you discuss the personal issues, personal frame, like your inner frame. Like you have to have strong frame control over your own bad tendencies before you can even hope to have frame control in these high stakes situations. Like if you don't respect yourself, then how are you going to be able to possibly have any kind of frame control over a boss that is just domineering and, making you feel inferior and so on? And the whole first third or fourth of the book is how to get personal frame. So I think that's really important. I think a lot of these self-help books miss that and miss the techniques for getting that. Like it's great to talk about, oh, everybody could be an entrepreneur and you just need to like do this. But hey, if someone's just feeling insecure all the time, or if they haven't dealt with their personal issues, they're never going to succeed as an entrepreneur.
Most definitely. And we call it the 5 pillars of inner frame within the book. And we begin with self-respect. And a lot of times I think self-respect gets thrown around, but people don't understand why we respect things. We respect things because, and the way I broke it down is that if I told you guys I went to Harvard, you guys would have some form of implicit respect for me. You'd be like, oh, wow, that's a smart guy. But if you found out the reason I attended Harvard was because my parents wrote a $15 million check to purchase a new building, all of a sudden that respect vanishes. But why? I still went to the school. And the reason why is because you no longer perceive what I did as being difficult, right? But it's not simply just doing difficult things, right? Let's say I see James, he's picking up trash on the side of the road, like down in Soho.
You saw me this morning?
Yeah.
I didn't think I was in disguise.
Right. And I was like, wow, like, James is just like, he's out there. He really cares about the community. It's really cold and he's doing this. But then I find out James is doing this only because he was mandated by the courts. And then I'd be like, it's not under his own volition, so I don't have as much respect for the difficulty of the action, even though it's still difficult. And how we describe it is respect is garnered by doing difficult things under your own volition, and it builds more self-authority. Self-authority is your ability to tell yourself to do something. You've had David Goggins and Jocko Willink on this podcast, and I've met both of them, and they are guys who have lots of self-respect. If they tell themselves to do something, whether it's wake up at 3:30 in the morning, run 200 miles, they're gonna do it. But you can't just wake up and do that. You have to build self-respect over time by constantly finding difficult things to do under your own volition, and it builds an upward cycle, but it also works in the negative. I used to be a drug addict, and when you're a drug addict, you just slide down the other way. You lose respect for yourself because doing drugs is easy, and you can't even get yourself to do the right things because you don't respect yourself enough to do those things.
And it's a cycle. So what drug were you addicted to?
So cocaine was my drug of choice.
So let's say you go out all night, at parties and you're doing cocaine or whatever, and then the next day you're wiped out, right? Like you have no dopamine left, no energy left. So now suddenly you're not doing anything with your life. So you lose even more self-respect. So you go to drugs to fill that hole, and it kind of cycles. Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of issues of self-respect or all these things tend to cycle into worse unless you're actively dealing with them.
Exactly. And the thing is, self-respect replenishes on a daily basis. So like, let's say you wake up early, you're getting everything done. It's easier to get more stuff done when you start off the day on the right foot, right? Brian Tracy says the beginning of the day is the rudder of the day. But when, let's say a day you woke up, it's at noon, and you're just like, you can't get yourself to even do things you want to do. And that's because your self-respect for that day is low. And so what you have to constantly be reproving to yourself by doing difficult actions is basically carrying on this process. And a difficult action is saying no to people and sticking to it. A lot of people can say no, but sticking to that no is hard. And so part of your frame begins with building boundaries with other people, but it's very hard to enforce those boundaries when you don't respect yourself. And so it's a big part of the thing. The other thing we talk about is self-acceptance, which is usually conflated with self-respect. But self-acceptance is basically like, do I feel like I deserve to be here, right? In a social, what things are coming up in your head before you go talk to somebody higher status than you? Are you like, yeah, I should be able to talk to them because I'm me? Or are you like, oh, they wouldn't want to talk to me, like I'm not even wearing the right kind of clothes? Like,
so what's a situation where you have self-respect but don't have self-acceptance?
So somebody who is very disciplined, who is, basically an Olympian or whatever, but then can't socialize with people because they're afraid of what people might think about them.
So let's take an example like By the way, David Goggins and Jocko Willink are great examples. Those guys have written essentially what you can call self-help books, but again, not based on science, but based on their experiences. Jocko has led men into war, and he wrote a great book, several great books, but my favorite among them is right now is Extreme Ownership. Also was a Discipline Through Freedom. David Goggins wrote Can't Hurt Me, and he went from being 300 pounds overweight, unhappy in every aspect of his life, to being maybe the most disciplined ultra marathon guy on the planet. And these are two great examples. But yeah, so you could imagine like David Goggins has so much self-respect, so much knows what he wants out of life and how to grow and how to personally improve. But you could imagine him saying, ugh, I don't really want to get this award. I'd rather be marathoning. There's other people who are out for the awards. And
yeah. Well, the first time he was on Joe Rogan's podcast, he was like, I had to hype myself up for 2 hours to get in here and speak, right? Whereas a comedian who, who has done nothing of that sort can walk in there and be like, yeah, and talk about whatever on there. And it's just like they're all things for us to work on. And a lot of this stuff comes from is our conditioning, and we're conditioned by society. And in the book, I got really personal, and I didn't know how people would take it. I talked about how being a Black Indian guy, there's a lot of narratives that I've subconsciously taken in that have limited me in the narratives I told myself of what I was worthy for in situations. And they were never come up with like, oh, I'm inferior. I feel inferior in this situation. It was in the subtext of why I would do something or why I wouldn't go for something. And so what you have to do is you have to take an active role in conditioning yourself within these spaces. And I actually,
but I always interrupt. I'm sorry. I'll stop. But I want to focus on what you just said. Black Indian community. What were the narratives that were artificial narratives that were holding you back? What were like 5 of them?
Oh my gosh, I love these clothes. Mizzen and Main. That's Mizzen and Main. It really is the most comfortable work clothes. Travel clothes. I had to travel this whole week. I'm traveling for a week and a half, and I just took Mizzen and Main clothes with me. Close out 2023 in style with comfortable, breathable, packable, and machine washable pieces from Mizzen and Main. As you wrap up your year-end goals, enjoy a Mizzen and Main dress shirt that you can wear confidently. I like that they've very, very just nice, solid colors. I don't really like to get all fancy in patterns and everything, although they do have some pattern shirts, but very comfortable clothes, stretchable pants. It's just super comfortable, but they look professional, and you can wear them casually or professionally. I like some of their flannel shirts or untuck shirts. I love untuck. I never tuck in. So again, whether you're shopping for a special someone or giving yourself the gift you really want, I just buy myself gifts. Mizzen and Main is the perfect gift for any guy who works, travels, and cares about looking and feeling great. As you could tell by my many photos across the internet, I care about looking fantastic. I'm practically a model. And let's be honest, every guy loves to look great. So again, shop now at mizzenandmain.com and save 20% when you spend $130 or more using promo code James. That's promo code James at Mizzen and Main, Mizzen and Main.com.
These days, we're all investors, trying to be smart with our money despite our worst impulses. But at iShares, we believe that deep down inside of every investor is a better investor. One that's just waiting to be let out. Explore iShares ETFs and insights and let your best investor out. Visit iShares.com for more information.
You know what I love about fantasy sports is that even though I'm not going to be a great basketball player or a baseball player or a football player or whatever, I feel like I get to participate and make decisions and use my knowledge of these different leagues or these different sports to compete. So it's like I can pick my team or I can pick my favorite players, and I could use my knowledge to make predictions and maybe even make money.
So with the basketball season here, you can now pick combo projections across football and basketball from the Specials League on Prize Picks. This is a league created specifically for combo projections that include two or more players from different sports or leagues. Want to play alongside some of Prize Picks' favorite players like rapper Meek Mill and comedian Andrew Schultz, who's also been a guest on this podcast, and I've been a guest on his? You can now find community plays under the promos tab of the app to view entries for some of the biggest names in the Prize Picks community each week. Look, Prize Picks even offers a reboot policy so that your entries stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. For football and basketball games, if you have a player who exits the game in the first half and does not return in the second, that player is rebooted. Prize Picks is the only daily fantasy sports platform with an injury insurance policy. What? So I love playing it. I love anywhere where I can use analytical ability with my interests to demonstrate some skill and maybe make some money. And I like the game-like aspect. I do wish they had chess as a category on prizepicks.com, but I'll settle for what they've got. Maybe I should make my own fantasy chess league. But in any case, I love Prize Picks. Go to prizepicks.com/James. Use code James for a first deposit match up to $100. That's the easiest $100 you're ever going to make. So that's prizepicks.com/James and use code James. Daily fantasy sports made easy.
What were the narratives that were holding you back? What were like 5 of them?
So these were the two biggest ones in my life that, so in Indian culture, it is very bad to have dark skin. You will never see a celebrity in India come out with dark skin from Bollywood because they hate darkness. And some of my family members would say things like, oh, you'd be so handsome if you weren't so dark. And I really internalized this. And I really thought it was impossible for me to be handsome and desirable with dark skin. And so I had to go through, and I call it going on your own advertising campaign, and I had to make up narratives of why I think I love my skin. And a lot of people say you can do this just once and accept yourself as if it's one moment that you get rid of a lifetime worth of anxiety and self-loathing, that you say, oh, now I accept myself. No, you have to constantly condition yourself. So I go in the mirror, and Brendan laughs about this. I get naked in front of the mirror, and I go through each part of my body, and I talk about how I love that part of myself, but I also get really crazy into narrative. I'm like, I love my skin because it's like chocolate. I got the same skin tone as Michael Jordan. You know, like my dad has this. And I get really into the storytelling of that because all advertising is, all these conditioned frames are just stories that we bought into. And so you have to take time to build up your own story, your own advertising campaign, your own movie within those moments. And so I did that. And then another thing was with height. So I'm 5'9", and in college I was seeing a girl, and she was like, "Will, you're just a little bit too short." And until that point, I thought my height was fine. I loved it. I fit in every chair. It was great.
Planes are no problem.
Planes were no problem. First class, I don't need it. You know, I had space in coach.
Let's not go crazy.
Yeah. And but then when she said that, the whole world grew like 8 inches, and I was like, oh my gosh, I felt so inferior. So then I went through the process, and I was like, the average height of a Navy SEAL is 5'9". I had Napoleon crowned himself. You know, like I built up a whole narrative around that thing and appreciating myself and not diminishing anybody else. A lot of people try to build up their frame by diminishing. You'll see this with a lot of racist groups. They'll be like, oh yeah, I'm so great because others are bad. It's like, no, you just want to learn how to appreciate yourself and build that context of appreciation for the parts of yourself. Because here's the thing, is we don't accept ourselves or not accept ourselves. We don't accept parts of ourselves. And so what you have to do is you have to work on accepting those parts of yourselves and what I call your immutable characteristics, the things that are fundamental to who you are, where you're from. You're never going to be from anywhere else. You're going to be from where you're from, your race, other things like that, and really practice those things because those are with you for life. Now, the mutable characteristics, things that you feel shame for, like, oh, I don't feel like, you know, I'm overweight and I don't like it. Change it. Yeah, it's less work to basically just go to the gym and change that than to do the mental gymnastics of trying to accept something that you know you can change.
Right. So I want to unpack this a little bit. So, and by the way, in terms of building your inner frame, which is absolutely critical to frame control in every other sense, and it's the key to the rest of this book. You say there are 5 pillars that house your inner frame: respect, acceptance, conditioning, outcome independent, and context. We'll talk a little about each, but with respect, there's 2 things I noticed. One is the same techniques you use to, or the same ways you respect other people, you have to use for yourself as well. So, like you said, you wouldn't respect me if you thought I've committed a crime and I was being court ordered to clean up the community. You would have less respect. So, and that leads you to say you respect people who are doing difficult things of their own volition. That means you have to have self-respect. You have to do things of your own volition. And then this is related. You also mentioned how there are some things that you have to recognize and be self-aware that some things you can't change and some things that you can. The importance of that is you don't want to be delusional. So, for instance, you don't want to say, well, it doesn't matter that I'm 5'9". If I want to, I could play in the NBA.
Mm-hmm.
That would be delusional. Instead, you have to find, you can't change your height, so you have to find you have to find and constantly remind yourself and reprogram yourself to be aware that 5'9" is not only good, but there could be great advantages being 5'9" versus 7'2" or whatever. And then that allows you to say, oh, but I also wake up at noon every day. I could maybe improve by waking up at 9 a.m. and going to the gym and improving my looks in ways that I can control, or improving my health in ways that I can control, and so on. And that's a difficult thing of your own volition. So I think those are two, the using the same techniques that you use to respect others on yourself is important, and the clearly defining what's immutable, unchangeable, and the things that are changeable and focusing on those to avoid being delusional is important.
Exactly. And what you have to understand is that you will never be society's ideal. No matter who you think is society's ideal, they're not. And we have this kind of avatar of what we imagine society wants us to be, but it is a fiction and it is not real. And so we tend to buy into other people's standards a lot. And when we try to buy into those standards of that society is placed on what you need to be, you're not creating your own standards. And that's a big part of self-acceptance, is living up to your own standards. You have to take the time and be like, what is a standard for the character that I'm trying to construct? Because a person who's trying to be a comedian is going to use their time a lot differently than a person who's trying to be a doctor. So you have to have a good way of evaluating how to respect yourself and stuff like that. But you don't want to take what I call the template frames of society, where it's like, go to this school, blah, 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 be this, be that, because you're never going to be those things. And honestly...
Yeah, this is a great point. Like, so what are there's what school did you go to? There's what job do you have? There's how much money do you have? There's how attractive you or your spouse are. There's, I don't know. There's probably other ones depending on the context, but those are like some of the big ones. There's also how fancy are your possessions, but that's related to how much money you have. That's signaling how much money you have. And then what's really important here, though, is what questions do you ask yourself to start building your own set of unique values independent of society that you could then use as the gauge to build your self-respect?
So this what actually I did whenever I was in Chicago and I did my TED Talk was I asked myself, what would someone who's trying to be a famous stand-up comedian do? And so I had a vision of what I wanted to be, and then I committed to the character that was going to basically make that happen. And I think it's really important that you because a lot of people, I would just say get started, because a lot of times, sometimes you can be so low that you can't even get an authentic image of what you want, because even our authentic image of what we think we want is populated by societies. Like, I remember in law school, I wanted to transfer to go to Harvard so I could be an academic and a lecturer at Harvard. That was not actually what I wanted. I did not find the law that intellectually fascinating. I just wanted the aesthetic of somebody who was a professor. And in ways I do that. I coach people on frame, but it was so perverted by where I was at that I was coming up with all these things I didn't think I actually wanted. So what I'd say is actually just begin your journey and start moving forward before you start being like, what do I want? Because a lot of times people try to say what their life is going to be at the beginning. It's like, dude, you don't even know. Just start gaining a skill, get some respect, and live honestly for a bit.
This is really important. I think a lot of self-help and motivational stuff misses this. And I've written about this as well. You can't think yourself into success. You can't think yourself into figuring what you want. Like, basically, you can't figure what you want, which implies thinking instead of doing. You can only try lots of things, like you say, try to move forward in various different ways. And if something kind of tugs at you and you enjoy it, you can say, okay, I'm gonna double down on this direction, not go as far in this direction. So you could say maybe you were in law school because you wanted to be a lawyer and you thought that was the acceptable thing, and then you started doing for instance, stand up or writing or coaching, and you felt like, oh, this is giving me more feedback that I'm enjoying. I'm enjoying this. This feels good. And you could start to double down on it. And that's where you start building your metric or hierarchy for success.
Exactly, because a lot of times what we want is really a phantom, and like things become more and more complex like the deeper we go into things. And I think a lot of times there's a lot of opportunities like left on the table that we don't. The beginning of this year, I was trying to sell a TV show, had gone out to France, all this stuff, trying to get on Sirius XM. And meanwhile, I had so many people who were coming to me trying to learn about frame. And so like the thing is, if I had asked myself, even at the beginning of the year, what does this ideal year look like? It was, getting my show, Brown Guys, picked up, right, by Lionsgate or whatever, whoever we're speaking to. But I wrote this book, which has been a deeply beautiful journey, and it's been the thing that I've been most excited about in my life. And so I think a lot of times people overemphasize what they think about at the beginning of their journey. And one of the things I would tell people to do is ask yourself in every moment, how do I make this a little bit better of a decision? I'm going to tell you it's the easiest way to hack self-respect, because a lot of times we start off the day, we don't have that much authority over ourselves, but we can make things a little bit better. And by conditioning your mind to always look to make things a little bit better, you'll take an opportunity a lot farther, right? Like if you're like, you're in line and there's a girl that you think is attractive. How do I make this moment a little bit better? Oh, maybe I'll say, hey, I just thought you're pretty. And then all of a sudden that's your wife, which actually happened to my dad. That's how my mom and dad
Really?
met. Yeah. So
He
they
just
met on a
walked
tour
up to
bus.
her and said,
So they were on a tour bus in London, and he basically was talking about how he just basically started talking to my mom, and we ended up like that. We ended up with me.
have you seen, you must see these like videos, they go viral all the time, where a guy will just go up to like 20 different girls and like say, hey, can I just hold your hand for a second? And she's like, what? And some of them end up holding his hand, and it's it works. Like if you kind of break out of the normal rule set and you're friendly and open about it. And
Exactly. Well, here's the thing is one of the things that I have really discovered is cynicism is pretending like you know how something is going to go before you try it. And so many people, they're listening to this and they're like, yeah, but I don't know if it works. And what cynicism does is that it basically traps you in a prison that's delusional. You don't know how things are going to go, and you don't know how far things are going to go. And so it gives you an excuse not to try. And I really think that a lot of people that I've seen become really good at things are just like not even optimistic, just like, hey, they trust that the universe, thank you. They trust that the universe can basically they can't predict things. And that's exactly the case. I mean, you've lived such a storied life from basically just taking risk and trying things out, and that's the beauty of things.
And it hasn't always been pleasant. Like, it's like you say, sometimes you think you want things because you're expected to want them.
Mm-hmm.
But like for instance, this is just a simple example. But 2 years ago, I was pitching what I still think is a really great idea for a TV show. A TV network bought it, and then bought the idea, and then a change in management kind of changed how they viewed the idea, and I had to decide, do I want to keep pitching the exact same idea? And I realized no, because once I had done all the pitches, I knew it was a good idea. But once I had done all the pitches, and once the network had acquired the idea, I realized, oh my gosh, this is going to be an enormous amount of work. And it's going to be 2 years before it even goes on the air. And I realized the only reason I wanted that particular show was to have other opportunities that I thought I couldn't get on my own. I didn't even want to do that particular idea because of all the amount of work that would require. And so really asking yourself these questions: what do I want? What's important to me? And then trying to find easy ways to experiment if this is something that really is what you want and is important to you. This helps you learn to say no and yes to the things that help you build self-respect. So you can start to now move in the direction of self-respect, because now you know what hierarchy you're on.
Exactly. And a big problem that a lot of people have with frame control, and like my experience as a dating coach, is too many people try to get they don't, number one, they don't have enough experience to basically be able to predict things. So whenever we're talking about like, oh, I was able, that's because I had like experience in these various things with people. But a lot of people who have no experience think they can predict everything that's going to happen. And that's just like largely not the case. And what you're better off doing rather than trying to predict everything is really commit hard to who you are in that moment and kind of be really present so you can get the most out of that situation.
Yeah, I think like I had a situation several years ago, a relationship situation that wasn't working out, and I didn't really have confidence in my inner frame in this relationship. Like I was out framed. And so I would call you and you would say, okay, here's what this person is trying to do, label it, and then do this. And this is what is going to happen next, and this is what's going to happen next, and this is what's going to happen next. Right down to when and who would be the first person to shed tears. And you were like dead on, like in every way. And I think it was really important for me. It was a big step for me, at least on the relationship side. I had always felt insecure and on that side. And it was really important for me to build kind of an inner frame of what do I really want? What's really important to me as opposed to what's important to society or how people see me or to my friends or whatever. Like what's important to me? And that's a really important question. But now, okay, so we've been talking about respect. We've been talking about acceptance. What's conditioning?
So conditioning is basically the process in which we get basically our name is conditioned into us by repeated process of being like, your name is James. Your name is James, right? We didn't pick our name. And conditioning is something that happens basically all the time through social conditioning, right? We're conditioned that, the president is somebody to be respected, that Harvard is a good school. And so a lot of our reference from the world is basically conditioned into us haphazardly and by messages from our parents, television, etc. And what we really push for is what we call autosuggestion or self-conditioning, where you choose your own conditioning. And particularly Jocko, I listen to Jocko's Discipline Equals Freedom Field Manual, which is a compilation of short poems all the time to basically give me the mindset of somebody who is a commando who survived through war, because I want those ideas populating my mind. And the longer you listen to the same simple message, see, a lot of people who are in self-help, they're like, oh, read 100 different books, read a different book a day. No, have one thing that you're reading all the time that's really simple so that it makes the thoughts reflexive. So the longer we're listening to something, the more it gets into our bones. That's why you go to boot camp. You go to boot camp to get conditioned into basically a space where you're going to be able to take a large amount of stress. So what we talk about is listening to something over and over again, not just reading it, because reading is a newer innovation, right? It's very likely that 3 generations back, your great-grandparents didn't know how to read. It's a new thing in the brain. It doesn't hit that same visceral component. When primates listen to vocal commands. So when somebody is telling us what to do, those voices really echo within our mind. And it's about basically filling in the gaps that our parents left for us by understanding, look, everybody's upbringing was imperfect in some way. Now it's up to us to find things to fill in those gaps and do them over and over again, because the younger we hear a message, the longer it takes to unlearn that message.
It's so interesting what you say about listening, because when I was reading that in the book, I realized I've never listened to an audiobook. I love reading books, but you're right. Maybe if I should at least try listening to one of my favorite books as an audiobook just to see if it affects me in a different way. Because you're right, it's more primal, the audio component, than reading a bunch of strange characters on a screen or a page or whatever. And it makes me even think about podcasting. Like I listen to my own podcast sometimes, but it's only in the past 2 months out of 6 years of podcasts that I've been doing podcasting that I've actually started listening to podcasts, and I love them. Like when I go to the gym, I listen to podcasts. That's how I survive the gym. So it's right. It's valuable to listen to stuff. And all right, we'll talk more about conditioning in a second. I think outcome independent, which is the fourth pillar of your building your inner frame. This is extremely important. This is basically the process versus enjoying the process or doing things where you enjoy the process over more important than the outcome. is really important.
Most definitely. So many times what ends up happening when we get into a high stakes environment, we become what's called outcome dependent, meaning that we need a particular outcome. And when we need a particular outcome, all of a sudden we have a very weak frame. James, you have a lot of billionaire friends. They don't need anything from you. So they have a very strong frame of reality because they don't need anything.
And they just treat me like shit as a result.
But like the thing is if you can.
I wish I had one billionaire friend that didn't treat me like, well, actually, none of them treat me anything. I'm zero. I've interviewed 20 billionaires on this podcast. I've had good interactions afterwards with one of them. So that's fine.
Yeah, and a large reason for that is they just have strong outcome independence. They don't need anything. The guys, a lot of times in dating coaching, like people be like, don't look needy. When you look needy, you look outcome dependent, which is unattractive. And so how you become outcome independent is, number one, when you want an opportunity, you think about how it's actually a bad opportunity for you. And that's counterintuitive, but what it makes you do is it makes you devalue the experience so you don't end up compromising on your values, which everybody's like, oh, I wouldn't do that. When you get in a high stakes situation, a moment that you need a win, you will feel that impulse. So understand that. Another thing that you gave me like advice about when I was trading crypto and I had way too much money in the market, and I was like, I'm not sleeping at night. And you're like, if you're not sleeping at night, you have too much in the market. And there was no amount of mental gymnastics I could do to make that not true, right? And that was a sizable amount. So what we recommend is if there is a point where you reach where you're too invested in the outcome, you need to actually divest. You cannot basically say like, oh, this doesn't really matter in the larger scheme of things. And what we really recommend is switching from a finite game concept of thinking to an infinite game concept of thinking. A finite game is we won or lost a football game. An infinite game is you look at your whole life as a massive movie, and that these wins and losses are just to move the game forward, right?
Right. And so then, like, if you win or lose a football game, or some contest or some promotion or whatever, it kind of feels bad at first. But again, looking at it in this broader context, what I've tended to experience is that in every negative event, there's usually some opportunity. Because a negative event might mean that opportunities are closed off in areas that you thought you wanted to succeed in. So given that now what that means is you now have extra time, because opportunities were just closed off from you. You now have extra time to pursue other opportunities that might be related, or you might use this skill set, and you'll find that there's actually more opportunities because you were losing here. Now there's an opportunity to win over here, in this other area. So like, again, I mentioned that TV show. I was very outcome oriented. I just wanted to have somebody validate, this is a TV show, we're going to make it, we're going to put it on the air. But I wasn't very process oriented until I realized, having this TV show succeed might be very bad for me. It might mean thousands of hours of work with no actual upside at the end. Like, that was the risk I was taking. And so I realized I wasn't being very process oriented. I was only outcome oriented. I only wanted the superficial benefits of having that particular TV show. And I wasn't looking at the process. And so it was easier to say, okay, well, I don't have to put in those thousands of hours. Maybe I could pitch a different show or a different idea that takes tens of hours or hundreds of hours rather than 2 or 3 years of my life. And so I think it's so important. And also, again, it's like what you were saying about setting boundaries. I know now what I'm going to say no to. I'm going to say no to things where the processes are going to require full devotion to me in only one area of my life. I like to have things going on in many areas of my life, and not say no when I think that I'm justifying an outcome for reasons that have nothing to do with the outcome.
Most definitely. And one of the things that really resonated with me that I heard from a guy named Owen Cook, where it was that in every moment you want to be able to give 100% of your intent, but be free from the outcome. And he said that's the secret to life. And I honestly really feel that's the case, because a lot of time when we're outcome dependent, we won't even try that hard, because sometimes we shield ourselves from really giving our full effort because we're like, what if I give it my all and I fail? Right? What if I actually try really hard and I find out, frankly, I wasn't good enough or it wasn't for me? And when you're able to really master this, and it's a skill, it's not just something like, hey, yeah, learn this once. You have to practice 100% of my intent, free from outcome. What would someone who's really trying to be famous or really trying to be an entrepreneur do? What are the ridiculous things? Our friendship is because I shot you a message on Quora, and I was like, hey, I'd love to have you on my podcast, right?
Right, which is, by the way, a very simple thing to do.
Yeah.
So, and you offered value.
And yeah, but at the time it felt so ridiculous. Like I remember having listened to your audiobook a few years ago. You're a best-selling author on the board of all these companies. But it was just like, look, I'm just going to 100% of my intent, free from outcome. We will cancel out so many opportunities for ourselves by not being free from the outcome. So just give it your all. And then if your all wasn't enough, then it's about who you became, right? Because it's not what you get, it's who you become.
It's so important because everybody starts off thinking, oh, I want to be a famous this or this or this. And then I like David Goggins is a great example. He didn't set off saying, I'm going to win a bunch of marathons or else it's worthless. I sort of feel like he goes into a marathon not caring if he wins or loses, but if he hurts a lot. Like, I feel like if he's in a lot of pain during a marathon, he views that as a success, whether he won or not. Like, it's, again, doing difficult things of his own volition. He's made that entire concept his process.
Yeah, well, he's focused on what I think it builds us the most happiness is character cultivation, right? And that was shown in his last race that he ran. It was a 240-mile race. He was hospitalized at a mile 120, left the hospital next day, finished the race. Doesn't get real credit for it because it's like the race was already over, but that's the kind of guy. His character means more than any kind of social approval. And that's what you really want. You want to be somebody that you yourself admire. And when you can cultivate that aesthetic for yourself, having a frame is intuitive. And one of the reasons why having a strong inner frame is so important is you can't deliver those lines later on if you don't really believe in yourself. They will sound like a whisper, or your voice will crack, or they won't have the real weight, or you won't be able to stick to those decisions. So it is really powerful when you really resurrect and look at yourself honestly and pull up those demons and get to your core of what's actually bothering you, and then coming up with a solution that we mentioned many in the book on how to fix those problems.
So this is all like we've spent a lot of time talking about the inner frame because I do think if you've kind of mastered this inner frame, and by the way, it's not a matter of just asking these questions like, where are your boundaries? What do you really care about? You really have to do trial and error. And like you said, and you kind of have to, like, it took me a long time to realize that when something really bad or negative happens in my life, it usually means there's a huge outcome. Like, that's an important part of my frame. It's how I deal with negative situations. And I've had really painful negative situations in my life. And finally, I've kind of come the other side to realize this. But a lot of these things you build up over the time, but some you can improve in bits and bits every single day. Like, the self-respect, what you do by looking at yourself in the mirror and even making fun of yourself. By the way, the humor of making fun of the different parts or humorously saying why you like these different parts of yourself, you say later in the book, that's how you kind of deframe someone or defend yourself against a frame attack when someone's trying to establish frame over you. So it's almost like on a personal level, it's like your weaker self is trying to outframe the self you want to become. So you use these defense techniques to fight the weaker version of yourself.
Most definitely. And so, like, one of the things I think it's very important to make fun of yourself once you've gone through this process of appreciating yourself, because you want to also hear the counter narrative. If you never listen to the counter narrative, you basically self-delude, because in anything that's an advantage for us is a disadvantage. And you want to be aware of that so it can't be used against you. So you're not caught off guard when someone's trying to attack your character. You're like, oh yeah, I make fun of myself all the time. I have a lot of resiliency here, and I have an immune system in this capacity.
So let me ask you a question. Like, let's say you're working with someone on building their inner frame, and you say, well, what do you want to do in your life? And they say, I want to have impact, which I feel is kind of like a meaningless answer. Like, a lot of young people say that, oh, I want to do things that have impact. Like, what would you say to that person?
Well, I'd be like, I would ask how are they impacting people right now? Because if you're not doing it right now for free, then you don't want to do it. And that's just the truth. Like, I
think that's real. By the way, I do say that to kids all the time about other things. Like, if someone says, oh, I want to be, I want to be a nuclear scientist, and yet they've never read any books about physics or the history of nuclear science or the biographies of the greatest nuclear scientists, I kind of say, well, you probably don't want to be, if you're not dreaming about it already, you don't want to do it. Which is a little harsh, but I think that's true. When you find your passion, you dream about it, you read about it, you think about it.
Yeah, and you're subconsciously doing it. I have been helping. I have been writing blogs on human behavior. No one's in law school and just becomes a dating coach. No one's studying the University of London, studying economics and stuff, and just going out and being like, oh yeah, I also want to teach guys this thing that at the beginning, I wasn't even great at, but I have always been wanted to do this, and it's always shown through. And so when it all kind of came together like this, it's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. A lot of people, they like the idea of being somebody, and so what I would say is, do you like the idea of having impact? And a lot of people have like pedigree. What they want, they want to have impact in a high status way. So they don't just imagine having impact. They imagine being Greta, like getting the Nobel Prize. That's what I want. It's like you want the emblems. You don't want the thing. And so I'd be like, you have to be honest with yourself. And I'd say impact's an awful answer. And unless you're actually out there doing something, I don't think you want that.
Right. It's like I had a friend once, this is 25 years ago. She told me, oh, I want to be a painter. I want to be a painter. She got watercolor, or she got oils, she got canvas, she got the whole thing. But she said, I want to do it in Paris. I feel like I'll be real creative in Paris. And that's when I'll open all these things. And of course, she never went to Paris. She's a computer programmer in like San Jose right now and has been for the past 25 years. And like, again, it's one of those things where your actions, that's a really good way to put it, is that your actions now have to align with what it is you want to do. And if they don't, that's not a problem. It's just you could start testing and shifting bit by bit. You could send an email to someone and see what happens. You could to take little steps.
We're a generation of people filled with, I have an existential crisis. I don't know why an existential crisis comes from not being useful and not having skills. So a lot of people, when they're like, I want to have, it's like, what skills do you have to have impact? How are you being valuable? What are you refining? And if you're not making skills for yourself, then you don't have any leverage. So a lot of times, living in New York, you date a lot of people with dreams. And, I've dated so many people where they're like, yeah, there's like no job out there for me. I just want to be able to do this. It's like, you're not good enough at the things you think you're good at in order to do the job you think you deserve. And it takes a lot of time. I think a lot of people have plans, but those plans are dumb. I think you should just focus on cultivating a skill, and life happens in such a weird kind of way once you develop skills that are valuable to other people.
So again, all this has been on the inner frame, because I think that's 50% of the battle. I think if you have like a strong inner frame,
a lot of it's intuitive.
Yeah, then it's going to kind of happen naturally. Oh, well, this doesn't feel good. This doesn't align with what I'm saying. But let's just now talk about so frame control, which is kind of the overall idea of this book. The Power Bible is such a strong concept, and you write about so many amazing techniques. And then also there's not only frame control, but there's defending yourself against people who do have strong frame control and who are attacking you with it. These techniques are life-changing, and I know this because I've used them. Sometimes I've used them accidentally, and I've just sort of learned them over time. Sometimes I've used them because someone like you tells me, oh, try this or try this. And just the combination of both, plus now reading this book, I have more ideas. This is an incredibly powerful tool. You even say in here, A, you mention how it's dangerous. B, you say Brendan actually in a section he wrote, he says something which is very true, which I've unfortunately noticed over time, is that as you use this more and more and move up in status of whatever hierarchy you're putting yourself in, you're going to get a lot of enemies too. Mm-hmm. And I have seen that in spades. Like, it is just crazy how your alliances shift. Friends become enemies. People who ignored you become friends. Enemies become friends. Everything sort of shifts, and you have to be able to roll with that, or that will stop you. But what's some of the frame control techniques?
Well, the first off is I really think the part of the book that I think is really powerful for people to understand is how status and power work and operate. And understanding, when you're talking about ascending up a hierarchy, is just people don't change their behavior based on what your personality is. They adjust their behavior based on your status.
So a lot of times people don't know that. A lot of times people think, oh, if I'm just nice to this person, they'll treat me better. So what do you mean?
So basically you're going to treat if LeBron James flakes on you, if he hits you up a year later, you're still going to hang out with him, right? But you might have a friend who is nice to you all the time that you flake on all the time. And the reason why is LeBron James closer to you than them? No, it's because of status and rarity and what you perceive that means about you. And so what you want to do is understand that status, fame, all these things are a spell. They're not actually real.
How do you pull yourself out of a status hierarchy? So let's say you get really interested in tennis, okay? Then suddenly the rankings in your local tennis club become the way you live your life. Like, oh, this person's ranked number 3 and I'm only ranked number 10. He's better than me. Or let's say your status hierarchy is your corporation. Oh, this person's a VP and I'm only a director, so I don't have as much status. How do you kind of like remove yourself from valuing people based purely on status?
Here's the thing is you won't be able to. The brain will constantly, our brains are meant to pick up on it because it's life or death. If you didn't recognize status in a tribe, they killed you. Right. So it's imperative. Your brain will always notice. But the key is it's not what you do, it's what you do next. You want to cultivate the awareness. The reason I'm supplicating right now, I am buying into this hierarchy. What would I do if I didn't care? I would just go sit with them. Then you do that. But it's about the awareness, not trying to make it automatic because it's not going to be automatic.
Sort of like the Tim Ferriss question. I think he asked this in Tools of the Titans. Like, what would you do or how would your life change if you had $100 million right now? Just do it.
Mm-hmm.
So, but okay. And then another thing is like, I've noticed sometimes for me, I can diversify hierarchies. So today, I'm trying to be good at this. So this hierarchy is a little more important to me. And you talk about this in the book, how to sometimes we're envious of people who are higher in the hierarchy, but try to turn that into admiration. And then you could start to emulate, what they're doing. But then I help myself a little bit more. I don't know if this is good or bad, but the next day I might be saying, okay, I'm going to try to get good at this other thing that I've been pursuing. And so now I'm in a different hierarchy. So I find if I'm not doing well in one hierarchy, I diversify hierarchies a little bit.
And one of the things we talk about in the book is different hierarchies credit different things. So we use MMA as an example. You cannot be at the top of the MMA hierarchy without being the best at MMA because it is a hierarchy that only validates objective wins and losses. Not that's it, right? Stand up, it's kind of in the middle. There's some people who are highly validated stand up, but they're good enough, right? And that's the thing with a lot of art. People try to treat art like it's an objective hierarchy. It's not. Art is a hierarchy built on familiarity, where I'm familiar with you, I'll help you out, and alliances with galleries, with mob bosses, with whoever's buying art, the Basel people. Those will shoot you up a lot faster than becoming very proficient at your craft because there's not an objective measurement for what art piece is better than another. That's why things in finance is not regularly the most competent people that ascend up sometimes. Sometimes it's just a person who looks the part. I had a friend of mine who was working for GS and made their table millions of dollars. They end up hiring on the person who lost them $700,000 that summer. And the reason why, that guy had a British accent and he didn't. And that guy fit the aesthetic. So you have to understand that like what is the cultural capital in the hierarchy that I'm getting ready to interact with, right? What are the things that, like, I'm not going to mention my stand-up credits in a law interview, right? I'm not going to be like, oh, I opened for Bill Burr. They're going to be like,
I've opened for Bill Burr too.
Yeah,
so,
yeah. They say, hey, but you recognize that's a thing in stand-up where people be like, oh my gosh, that's really great. That's capital in that one area. It doesn't have cultural capital in another area. And so you want to be aware of, number one, what are the things that impress within this hierarchy? How can I offer value without being a sycophant? Because like sometimes you're like, oh, hey, can I do anything for you? And I'll grab coffee. They never respect you. It's a lot better if you go in as an accountant and be like, hey, man, like, I'm just trying to get better and be around the thing. I can help you with your accounting if you teach me some skills.
So a lot of frame control is a set, whatever hierarchy you're in. And it might even be just a 2-person hierarchy, a relationship, or a 2-person hierarchy, a sales. You're selling one person you're selling somebody something. It seems like frame control is all about ascending the hierarchy as quickly as possible.
Most definitely. And seeing, like, I remember when I started doing comedy, you think the open mic host is getting ready to be famous, right? That's intuitive because you see them in control in their element. You always want to question, why are the people in power in power? Not, is it unfair or whatever. We want fairness to go out of the question because fairness doesn't exist. You want to be like, why are they there? And how deeply are they there, right? One of the things we talk about in the power dynamics section is there are people with fixed power, contextual power, and a fluid power, right? Where it's like, status, where it's like, nightclub owner, that guy in his environment is God, What he says goes, right? The only people who can remove him are the state and the banks. And that's going to be a whole nother thing, right? But that night, anything he says goes, right? Then it goes down the manager. And then maybe if you buy a table, you have contextual status. While you purchase the table, you have like some rights. You can point to the menu and be like, hey, I need this or whatever. But you don't have like legal rights in the place. It's pretty easy to remove you. And then let's say fluid status is like, oh, you go to, I mean, you're hanging out with somebody at a table. And they're like, yeah, hey, dude, I'm kind of bored. Go away. Well, you had fluid status right there. For a moment, you looked really cool, but it was easy to remove you away from power. So you want to see how fixed is this person's relationship to power, and who do they have to satisfy to keep power?
I think also changing the narrative of what power is. So again, you might be in a corporate hierarchy where you're the assistant vice president, and you might say, oh, the vice president works hard. He, went to all his boss's parties and did all this extra work or whatever. But you could also change the narrative and say, you know what? If I quit this job and just become a consultant in the industry, that might even make me higher in the hierarchy. So this company could be a client of mine. My boss could end up being the underling of my client, and then I've changed the narrative, even though I've stayed in the industry.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I think we really hit it off is we're kind of guys who float from circle to circle and everything like that, and it makes it very hard. People are always just like, how much should I respect you? And since they don't know, they usually default higher than they should. And that's because when you go into a hierarchy, you gain benefits, you gain resources, you gain access, but you also lose out on individuality and the ability to do those things. And there's a stifling element of hierarchies where one of the things that we talk about is the difference. There's layers of identity, right? There's like individual identity, like who you are as an individual. There is like a conversational identity. Who am I? I'm in a one-on-one conversation. But I've had this happen where I'm talking with someone, we're having a great conversation, but when we get in a group, the same thing they were agreeing with me about in one-on-one conversation, they're no longer agreeing with because they don't feel like they have enough status to basically go along with what I'm saying. And I don't have enough status in that conversation to make them laugh at that thing.
Or they have other agendas. In a new hierarchy.
Exactly. So you want to be perceptive of how people change the more people are involved.
So this is the crux of the matter now. So I find for myself, a lot of situations I feel like I'm good at. Like I'm good when I'm selling something that I'm passionate about. I feel I'm great. Like I'm great at that. But when I'm in a situation where someone has authority over me, or I'm feeling insecure or a little inferior, I tend to be pandering, and and I'm even aware I'm not feeling comfortable. I'm like losing a little control of what I'm doing here. What are some techniques to, again, not be self-aware, because I get that, but what are some frame control techniques now? Like let's say I'm going into the boss, I need a promotion. What do? I want to raise in a promotion.
So let's say this is, let's say you go into your boss, right? And you ask for a raise, and then they're like, well, blah, 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 whatever reason, they don't want to give it to you, right? The first thing you want to do is you want to create silence. You want to create a validation vacuum while maintaining contact and just kind of ponder.
So these are frame control techniques. A validation vacuum.
And a validation vacuum is, so it oftentimes it feels like when we're defending ourselves, we are basically annihilating frame, but we're actually validating the frame. So the more energetic you are, the more you're giving the frame of dissent energy. And
so like I asked my boss, I say, hey, it's that time of year. I'd like a promotion, a raise. He's like, nah, maybe next year we'll consider. Times are tough. Now he'll get, or she'll get, validation from any argument because it's fitting the narrative the boss has already thought of. So you're saying don't validate what he just said.
Seconds. You take a few seconds, make them doubt what they said. Here's the thing: is a lot of this stuff, by creating validation vacuums, people start getting anxious. They're like, wait, what is he getting ready to quit? What is this, right? And you create a state of anxiety. I mean, we've all been around somebody who, when we're talking and then they just look at us blankly, and then you're like, feel the need to keep talking, right? Because as they keep talking, they might give you objections. They might be like, oh, and I know you've been working really hard this year, right? They might start arguing against themselves. So you just take a couple of seconds, let them, and you want to not have an angry face, but you want to have a blank face.
So that's technique number one.
Yeah.
Silence / validation vacuum.
Validation
which is related.
vacuum. And then for this, you want to get them to explain themselves. So why is this? Why? And then once they start giving reasons, they get them to go as long as, because you want them to feel desperate to hear your words, right? They start going a lot longer about like, well, it's just like money's tight or blah 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 or all this other stuff. And
what if they just say money's tight?
Yeah, so money's tight. You say, so there is no money available to reward good work. Now, if they say there's no money available to validate good work, then you start saying, is the company okay? So now you're catching them in a bind, right? They're like, wait, well, no, the company's fine. It's just, so the company is fine, yet there is no extra money to validate good work, right? Then, so let's say they are just jam-packed. They are not going to give you money. But they want to validate that you have done a good job. You've done a good job and blah, blah. It's like, well, what other ways can we think about of rewarding good behavior, Now, maybe you explore coming in on terms that are yours. Because there's some people, they can't make the movement, right? Sometimes there is no money left, right? Well, maybe you can come in less. Maybe you can work from home more. Maybe, you want to take this big trip out, you want to work remote. Maybe in writing, you want to get like, hey, when is this going to happen? Or you want to get them started on the process. So maybe they can't give you the full $1,000 increase right then. Well, let's say, okay, that's fine. Let's do a $250 increase right now and then do it in steps rather than waiting a whole next year. You want to provide them with different ways out that they hadn't been considering, right? You want to constantly be reinventing the frame because too many people go into what I call a binary frame component, a win-lose, a false dichotomy. No, we can't do what you asked. That's it. And you're like, oh, well, do.
And critical, like let's say they even say, well, you're not ready yet for the promotion in my estimation. At the very least, you don't want to try to convince them because now you have a weaker frame. Yeah. You don't want to say, but I did this, when after so-and-so quit, I took on their job. Like, what would you do then if they kind of like invalidate your what you think is your rightful promotion?
Well, so number one is, does everybody feel this way, right? And so, like, number one, you're just like, because then you're going to be, they're thinking like, wait, what does he mean by that? You take your time and you're going to be like, go through specifically why I'm not ready, right? Specifically. So now they're having to come up with this massive, elaborate thing on like why you're not ready for this. And then now you're going to be like, I'm going to have to think about a lot what you had to say, right? You take it away from them, right? You don't have to answer right there. This doesn't have to be something solved right there. It's not a closed thing. But now you have time to basically, number one, they've given you a blueprint of what you need to do to basically be promoted in their eyes. You can just do that within a month. And then, hey, look, I've done everything you've asked. There's no reason. You wrote this out. These are the things you said I needed to do. Now you've just been armed with ammunition to basically go in and change the narrative. A lot of times people overestimate what can be done in one conversation when you're there. You can have multiple conversations, right? But a lot of times, a lot of people are working with a nebulous standard, right? One of the things Andrew Yang, I love Andrew Yang, he says, I love the DNC for telling me exactly what I need to do in order to make the next debates. So I know how to focus my time. So that's exactly what your boss just did for you right there. It's like, tell me exactly specifically what it is. Because the more they're like, well, your character, blah, 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 that's not something you can work with. Make them get specific.
Okay, so let's take a spouse situation. So let's say the spouse, male or female.
Also, one thing I want to say just is make sure you're in neutral rapport tonality. And this is something that's like a lot, it's something that is in my course, but we can't communicate it over the book, is the way, if you're like, hey, I really do feel, that's called upward tonality. Your voice is going upward in inflection. That's already submissive in nature. So you might even be saying the right thing, but they're not going to take it as seriously. And some people's accents are naturally structured to be submissive.
I tend to do that. When I'm nervous or feeling insecure or inferior, I tend to go upwards in tonality, and I need to avoid that.
Yeah, just make sure it's just like neutral and slow. And what I would say is if you notice you're talking fast, pause rather than try to slow down. Because if you're like, no, I just feel like this, and then you're like, but this is the case, and then it sounds weird. But if you're just like, I just feel like I've been doing a lot of really good work, and I really feel that's all of a sudden you get a different rhythm.
Yeah, it makes sense because you whenever you talk to someone who's panicking, they're usually talking fast. If you're talking to someone who's not panicking, they're usually talking slower. So okay, what's another situation, a common frame control situation?
Well, so a lot of times, let's say this is, and we talk about this in the intimate relationship section, because there's a different rule to intimate relationships, and that's not just romantic. That's somebody we're close to. There are a lot of manipulative tactics that people do, and they're not even aware of it. So There's like the habitual crier, right? Or the person who gets belligerent in certain circumstances, where whenever you're trying to make them confront a truth about themselves, all of a sudden they get really mad and they're yelling and they're bringing up 8 things that you did, and now you feel like you're trying to defend yourself on 8 fronts. This is the same thing. You create a validation vacuum. Number one, and a lot of times with belligerent people, I'd say get out of the place, because they're not going to let you say your argument in a way in which that is compelling. You want to separate from them and write a letter. The reason why you want to write a letter is they, number one, get the totality of your argument. They're not going to straw man it midway. And you want to create a validation vacuum by leaving whenever they get like this, so that, number one, they become anxious just to hear from you, right? So and you're not kind of subjected to their overbearing presence. Now, a manipulative crier does this, but in the same way, where like maybe you're talking with someone and they start crying. And I'm not saying every person who starts crying does this, but there are people that anytime you try to bring up something where they might look bad, they start crying. But whenever they're in the right, they're never crying. You want to create enough space where, number one, you want to watch them cry, which will seem like you're a sociopath. But the reason why is you want to let this emotional state go out. And they're going to probably say things like, to get you engaged, you don't do any of that. If anything, you just repeat your one point. And whenever people try to bring up a myriad of other things that you're doing wrong in an argument, you say, those might be true, but we're talking about this right now. You want to keep it focused on the topic at hand.
So I think so this is very important, because this is related. So in kind of a romantic or relationship situation or an argument, oftentimes someone's trying to argue with you, or maybe you're the one trying to arguing, and someone, if they can't win in one direction, and I use win in quotes, if they can't win in one direction, they'll change the topic and say, well, but then there was this situation. And then you say, well, no, I wasn't even there then. No, but then there was this situation. So I think there you're what you were just saying is important, but your labeling technique is really important, where you just, and this is from the book, where you just simply say, okay, it's okay if we change the topic, but could we, what are we talking about here? Like, are we talking about the first thing you brought up, or is there something bigger? Like labeling what's happening and pointing out that topics have changed instead of letting them sort of drift wherever they go, in a sense, controlling the frame. I think that labeling technique is really critical.
Yeah, and also keeping the conversation focused. That's like the really hard part, where one of the things we recommend in the book is do not try to solve the reason for a fight during a fight. That's going to sound so counterintuitive, but a fight is actually a frame battle gone wrong. And what happens is, number one, a fight is meant to dominate the other, not to kind of come up with a solution. And so you're going to...
So what are you supposed to do? They're fighting, and you just said, hey, did you just change the topic? Can we get back to the original topic? How do you
a fight needs 2 people to participate in. So when you feel that you are getting in a place where you are fighting, then that means, hey, we're getting heated. There's nothing going to be solved right now. Let's take some time, come back to this. And what I suggest doing in this part is you want to become them. What I call and not just, imagine their side, which is a superficial way of doing this. No, you want to look at the situation in a way in which where you become them, where you imagine what it's like to grow up like them, their incentives, basically what books that they read, the ideology that they buy into, what their friends might say, all of these things. And you want to argue against yourself. So you understand with deep empathy where they're coming from, right? Then what you want to do is then build your argument on top of that. And the problem that a lot of people have is they'll think about the other point of view. They won't think about their own, go back and then be like, yeah, you're 100% right. No, you have validity. You want to think about your point of view last. You want that to be the last thing you think about before you go in.
So part of frame control is validating their frame as much as possible. So I kind of going back and forth, I guess, between a validation vacuum when they're too off course, you feel, and you're trying to just calm things down,
or just even know what you're actually arguing about. So sometimes, the example, and you call this the right reason and the real reason, right? Like, and I use the example in the book. Let's say you have a son who's like, hey, I really need a car to drive from school to work, and you're like, oh, I can solve that easily. I can just drive you. I'm free at that time, and all of a sudden it's manifesting into this huge fight, and you're like, what's the issue? Well, the thing is that if you're imagining being a teenage boy, probably wants time alone with his girlfriend, the freedom that comes with a car, the cachet, the insecurities. So you can actually talk about the real issue, that he wants freedom and autonomy, not necessarily that he needs someone to drive him from school to work.
So I feel like there's so many interesting situations and there's so many specific techniques that you bring up that are so powerful. And what was great was a lot of them I recognized as, oh, I've used this once or twice in this situation, but actually seeing them written down and putting a name to the technique makes it easier to have it like literally right there in my head, in my arsenal of frame control techniques. And again, it's good for ascending a hierarchy. It's good for making a sale. But by the way, Steve, if they ring the doorbell, can we keep them out there for like 5 more minutes or 10 more minutes? Yeah. So what would be? Let's say it's a sale. I'm making a sale. I call you up. Hey, I thought you might be. I noticed you just bought a car. Maybe you want a better car insurance. Like, what do you think?
Number one, you got to meet them where they're at, right? Number one, you don't want to go in trying to sell up top because like they don't trust you. You want to establish trust in a sale, right?
How do you establish trust?
Yeah, basically by, hey, what's up? Understanding where they're coming from. Hey, what's blah blah blah. Just you're on a list for health insurance. I mean, a health insurance thing is not something I have personal experience with, and there's a lot of dynamics you can't control on the phone. But let's say you're in the middle of a sale and you're talking to somebody and you're trying to get them to purchase something. Number one, you want to find out their pain points. How does your thing actually solve their problem? So many times people get obsessed with how their product is a standalone product, and you should get how this works, right? And a large part, like when I'm selling the frame control thing, I'm not like, your frame control this is the best course ever. It will change your life. I'm like, how great would it be to make 10% more money every year? Right? Like, if they mentioned that, like, oh, I would like a bigger house or whatever like that. Or like, oh, I'm kind of lonely. I'm not having the relationships I want or whatever like that. You find out where they basically sell themselves on your product, right? So if they're not having the relationships they want, it's like, why do you think that is the case, right? And they're like, oh, I don't think girls like guys like me or whatever like that. It's like, I think you're having a weak frame about yourself and your own concept of value. If you don't think you're valuable, why should someone else think you're valuable, right? And then you start working from that pain point and how your product solves their problem, right? Where they basically get to explain to you why they need to buy your product. And you can always appeal back to that.
So again, this book, there's so many incredible sections. I feel like we've only made a dent in it. And what I like is that there's so many techniques and there's so many permutations of the techniques. Like every situation requires like a different set of these tools. But the first part is building that inner frame. Then there's frame control. Then there's how to defend yourself against a frame attack, which happens a lot more often than people think. Like you're always under attack in every situation, I feel. And then there's also discussion about being a frame addict. What do you do about that person who constantly needs to be the center of attention? It's hard to stay in a room with them, and you don't want to be that person too as you learn these techniques. But I like this one quote in the book. You say, courage requires fear. You must be afraid of something to experience the virtue of courage. When you take steps towards what you're afraid of, you are guaranteed the gift of courage, which provides you with euphoric feelings that give you a strong frame. Acting courageously is bold, and being bold is an integral part of having a strong frame. What I like about that, it reminds me of writing, because I always tell myself if my writing is going to be unique and interesting, I can't hit publish unless I'm afraid of what people are going to think of me. And it's almost the same with that quote. Like you kind of have to constantly stretch the comfort zone. Otherwise, people are going to treat you, if you're always in, let's say the friend zone is the same as your comfort zone in your relationship with a person. So if you don't stretch that comfort zone, people are always going to treat you like a friend when you want something different.
Most definitely. And also a lot of times we shy away from things because we're afraid what we might actually find out, right? So a lot of times people, confuse patience with cowardice, and courage allows you to actually earn the virtue of patience. Because if you're not courageous, you're just going to be like, oh, I'm patient, but you're actually just a coward. You're not actually going out and taking those opportunities, and you're basically writing it off as another virtue. But when you are courageous, when you actually have done things and have been reckless in certain circumstances, when you say, actually, I think here I need to be patient, that actually means something.
Right. And also, again, you could, if something scares you, if it's too big of a jump, take a smaller jump. Just do something. Something in that direction of fear. Because you could I could just step on an ant, and that's a little bit safer for me than stepping on a wolf. But it's like, I still might be afraid of an ant, but it's a tiny microscopic step. You could always do something microscopic.
Yeah, so many times people get caught up with the perfect move, And number one, the perfect move doesn't exist, especially close to the beginning. What you want to just do is a better move. And sometimes, the better move requires courage. That's the cost you pay, but also courage gives you self-respect, right? The more courageous you act, the more you respect yourself, the more you can ask yourself to do. And so the thing is that it's such a virtuous cycle where all these virtues kind of feed each other in a really symbiotic way.
So, okay, Bill, first off, I even told you when you got here, this is one of the few books that has blown me away. I felt like my IQ was rising while I was reading it. And again, I recognized so many of the techniques, and I saw new ones that I could think of situations to use it in, or ways in which I've been failing in different interactions in my life. How do people get the Power Bible?
So the Power Bible, you can get it at framescholar.com, where basically
framescholar.com.
And basically it's that it comes as a part of my frame control masterclass, which basically goes through all of these lessons and even more things that we couldn't even include in the book. And and there's also
what couldn't you include in the book?
Like for example, my voice course, which is basically a lot of people have weak frames because they don't have a voice that tells them they should have a strong frame. That's something I can't communicate within a book. I also have exercises. I have my mentorship community run through a diagnostic of a FAQ, and then there's a lot of what I said, where it's like a lot of a message of something is communicated through like the delivery of it, like the power of that delivery to the individual.
So they get the Power Bible with
voice course, my discipline course on basically how to go from where you're at to implementing all these different rules, the 9 layers of discipline, with also a course with 183 lessons and the book.
What's like an exercise that's in the course that's not in the book?
So
you give some exercises in the book.
So one of the things basically I go through deeply on the voice course component of it, on how to represent your voice and how to slowly get it deeper. Like if you listen to my first podcast with James and listen to it now, there's actually a massive difference, and that didn't happen automatically. And I go through how to diagnose these things, or basically how to I talk about not analogizing, letting people analogize your arguments. Right? It was something I didn't mention in the book because it's kind of petty, and the book is kind of meaningful. But if someone tries to analogize your argument, they're changing it. So if you're like, that analogy doesn't fit, and you take back the power, because a lot of people try to no, it's more like this. No, now you're giving their analogy frame.
So it's related to the zoom out, zoom in techniques.
Exactly.
But maybe they're also trying to slightly change the topic at the same time, and you're labeling it. But you have to practice recognizing that.
Exactly. And then there's just like a lot of just subtle nuances where I go through a detailed thing of how to get a job you don't deserve, how to get more money, how to leverage more of these things, how to get more, how to get dates, how to get out of friend zone. I have all these FAQs that aren't included in the book that are included in the course, and also just like audio commentary for longer form videos. So it's 183 lessons. And it's just honestly, as a whole package, it's just going to revolutionize your life.
And I have to ask this, so framescholar.com, what can we do for listeners of this podcast right now? Because I really think this is valuable. I love the book. I'm aware of the course. I know I love the course. I want people to get this. What can you do for them? I'm going to negotiate right now. I have Frame right now.
Yeah, he has Frame. It's his podcast. We're in his house. It's great art, social proofing. Dude, let's do 30% for your base. Like, I mean, you're the big reason why a lot of this has happened.
So are you going to set up a page like framescholar.com?
Yeah, and the coupon code will be there, and it'll be Altucher Podcast.
Okay, Altucher Podcast. Can you set up a page like framescholar.com/James?
Yes.
Okay, so then you'll automatically recognize like these are all people from James' podcast and stuff.
Yeah, most definitely.
Okay, I think this is so valuable. I want to have you on again to talk about more. There's so many different situations.
I'll get Brendan on. Brendan.
Brendan on.
Brendan went from being just to put it, how powerful this guy is. Went from being homeless to making over 6 figures while doing comedy. I mean, he is just one of the smartest people we both know, and I think would be an excellent guest.
Yeah, and this has always been like an odd friendship for me in the sense that, how old are you?
I'm 29.
So you're 29, I'm 51, and yet we've both called each other, but I've probably called you even more for advice than you've called me. Now, admittedly, I've given you big, huge, valuable piece of advice in one go at different times. But like you've given me lots of tactical advice in like 100 different situations. So it's been really like, I'm so happy to see how this book how you've written it, and then the course. like this is going to be a reference. The book and course is going to be a reference point for me in just my own persuasion parts of my life and frame control and moving around. Like I'm a big believer in how do you skip the line in hierarchies, and a lot of these techniques I'm going to basically steal from you and try to write in my next book, although, not as well as you've done here. Just take bits and pieces that I personally use, but it's so valuable. At the very least, if okay, here's another thing. If someone goes to framescholar.com/James, can they get, you said you have 183 lessons. Can they get a couple for free just to see what it's like?
Yeah, so I actually have 3 webinars on there that basically cover a lot of what we covered in here, but specifically on how to make more money from frame control, how to which is like a 50-minute thing, how to have a better romantic life from frame control, and how to get the body of your dreams, which a lot of people don't think is about frame control, but it's really about holding frame with yourself. And so those 3 videos I have on there, and I'll have like a couple short, like little tactic videos on there as well.
Excellent. Well, Bill Beteet, frame control expert, lawyer, dating coach, comedian, world traveler. You're heading out of the country in a few weeks, right?
Yeah.
For forever? What's going to happen?
So I'm moving to France, and one of the primary reasons is I'm writing a book on the metaphysics of identity and basically transcending culture, tribalism, and our multiplicity of identities. And a lot of French philosophers and French sociologists have written about it. And I've gotten to a point where I no longer want to read it in a language that's not the native language, because I think that there's something sometimes lost in translation. And so I wanted to go there, number one, learn how to speak French and everything like that, and then get access to the culture that produced the thinkers that have been kind of thinking about a lot of this stuff that we haven't necessarily been thinking about in Anglo-Germanic kind of the philosophical tradition.
Well, good luck on that.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
and come back soon, because it's better when you're here. And framescholar.com/James. They can get all this stuff. Power Bible, all the free webinars, access to your course, your mentorship community, or membership, whatever it is. And thanks again for coming on. This is so valuable, and the book was really fantastic. I'm really happy I read it.
I truly appreciate you. Thank you so much for having me on, and thanks again, man.
Yeah, thanks, Bill.
AI might be the most important new computer technology ever. It's storming every industry, and literally billions of dollars are being invested. So buckle up. The problem is that AI needs a lot of speed and processing power, so how do you compete without costs spiraling out of control? It's time to upgrade to the next generation of the cloud, Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, or OCI. OCI is a single platform for your infrastructure, database, application development, and AI needs. OCI has 4 to 8 times the bandwidth of other clouds, offers one consistent price instead of variable regional pricing, and of course, nobody does data better than Oracle. So now you can train your AI models at twice the speed and less than half the cost of other clouds. If you want to do more and spend less, like Uber, 8x8, and Databricks Mosaic, take a free test drive of OCI at oracle.com/advance. That's oracle.com/advance. oracle.com/advance.